Very good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for the invitation to be here today and to talk about the role of the IMF in surveillance of Egypt's economic performance post the economic reform program. Before I begin, by way of background, I moved here about a year ago to open and head the office of the IMF in Egypt. And I want the community at AUC to especially know that we are your neighbor. Our office is quite close, and our doors are always open to any and all of you if you are interested to learn more about the role of the IMF in Egypt. So I welcome you to come and visit us sometime. I would like to begin by putting in context the current relationship of the IMF with Egypt. As some of you may know already, who are familiar with us, we have three levels of engagement. The first, and the one that gets the most media attention, is the financial assistance that we are providing in support of the authorities' reform program. We started this in 2016, and at $12 billion, this is our largest loan in the region. Of this amount, we have already disbursed $8 billion. There are $4 billion left. And the program, the loan, expires in November of next year, so we have about a year left. The purpose of this loan is to support the authorities' homegrown reform program. This reform program focused on three key areas, and I think it is good to remind ourselves what those were. First was to restore macroeconomic stability. Second, and it's important to note this, was to enhance the social safety nets to better protect the poor during the implementation of the economic reforms. And the third area was to advance structural reforms to support the private sector to create the needed jobs to cater to Egypt's young and dynamic population. Now, the program has proceeded successfully, and there has been a marked turnaround in economic sentiment, as noted earlier by Tariq, Hisham, and by others. At the same time, it is important to translate this improved market sentiment to more jobs and rising living standards, especially for the middle class. And the government's ongoing structural reform areas in areas such as promoting competition, improving industrial land allocation that Tariq also spoke about, the role of state-owned enterprises, and several others, these reforms that the government has on its agenda will go a long way to achieve this goal of translating the improved market sentiment to rising living standards. Now, there's been a lot said about the reform program and the loan, so I don't want to dwell on that here. Instead, I want to focus on the two other areas of our engagement with Egypt. Now, these are areas where we are heavily engaged, and these are areas where our engagement will continue after the end of the loan, after the end of the financial assistance. And these two areas are first the provision of technical assistance, and second is surveillance. I want to talk to you about each of these and explain to you a bit about what they mean. But before I do that, I want to note that, the IMF has 189 member countries. And for most of our members, about 80% of them, most of our relationship is characterized by surveillance and provision of technical assistance. It is only a small fraction of our members, 20%, where we are providing financial assistance. So a relationship which is centered around surveillance and technical assistance is the norm for the IMF. So let me first talk about technical assistance. and what this means. So in very simple terms, this is the provision of advice in specific economic policy-related areas based upon international best practices. We organize this by having missions of experts visit from headquarters in Washington, D.C., or regional technical assistance centers. And often we bring, in addition to our staff, experts in the particular areas. These missions are not part of the loan program. And they are meant to complement the reform efforts that the government is already doing. So they can be in areas related to the loan, but they are also in areas that are not in the loan, but reforms that the government has already been undertaking. These missions are typically confidential, so they don't get as much media attention, but they take up as much of my time as any other mission. Now, what are examples of such engagement? I'll give you one very recent and very important area, which is called Medium-Term Revenue Strategy, or MTRS, something that the IMF has been advancing recently. And it is an approach and a strategy that starts off with the goal of defining what are the key social and other economic objectives that a government plans to reach, such as sustainable development objectives or others related to education, health, poverty, and so forth. It then does the costing exercise of what would be needed in terms of government spending to achieve these goals. Having done that exercise to cost them, it then defines what are the needed revenues from different sources and what needs to be done to the revenue system to attain those goals. Now, remember, this starts off with the objective of achieving social goals. All right? Even if a country does not have a high level of debt or a high level of deficit, this strategy is based upon what is needed to achieve social goals. And we have recently started a very constructive engagement with the government on developing such a medium-term revenue strategy for Egypt. What is our role in this is to support the government's effort by providing expertise from my colleagues who have developed this in other countries, such as, for example, Indonesia. We've had missions of these colleagues, and we also have regular video conferences between the authorities and our colleagues through the IMF office here, for our colleagues to provide and share with the government what has worked in other places. So this is one example of an ongoing technical assistance that is very key to achieving certain social objectives in Egypt. There are many other examples as well in which we have been providing technical assistance. You know, now these are all listed in our staff reports, which are published periodically, but usually a lot more interest, as I mentioned, is in the loan and not in the other parts of the document. So, for instance, we are providing assistance in public financial management. We are providing assistance in developing better statistics and several other areas. If you want to see a list of these, you will find them in the most recent staff report that we have on Egypt and available on our website. So this very briefly is what I wanted to say about technical assistance. I will maybe add one more thought on this before I move on to talking about surveillance, and which is that the technical assistance does not come with any conditions. Okay, so it's provision of advice. And it is up to the country authorities to decide what to do with this advice. Some countries follow up quite proactively on this advice and follow up with us to get more. You know, they demonstrate to us that they are implementing the recommendations, and we are happy to support more. In some other countries, countries don't, because maybe they're busy with other issues or so forth. But at the end of the day, what happens with this technical assistance is really up to the country authorities, as it doesn't come with any conditions. So let me move on to the second area, which is surveillance. And surveillance, or in other words, economic monitoring, was one of the core mandates of the IMF when it was created. By becoming a member of the IMF, a country not only has a claim on IMF's resources, it also agrees to invite the IMF's surveillance on the policies of that country. And the key reason that this is important is because countries are interdependent in a global economy, and the policies of one country, the economic policies of one country, are important to the IMF not only from a consideration of what is needed, in our view, to strengthen economic prosperity, but also from a perspective that there are linkages across different countries. Now, how does the IMF exercise this surveillance or economic monitoring? We have two key vehicles, and the first is what we call bilateral surveillance. Our articles of agreement require a periodic visit by IMF staff. This visit is usually annually to assess the economic situation in a country. This means taking stock of recent economic developments, looking at the economic outlook, and forming our views on the appropriate policies. You can think of it as sort of an annual health check. This is called the so-called Article 4 consultation, because it comes from the fourth article of our Articles of Agreement. These reports are usually published with the consent of the authorities, and they are all available on our website. So if you go on our country page for Egypt, you'll find the last few Article 4 reports that we have done, the most recent from earlier this year, the one before that, I believe, from 2015, another from 2010, and so forth. And what you'll find in these reports is a very candid narrative of the discussion that took place. There is a section where IMF staff describe what they said, what advice they gave to country authorities on various economic issues, whether it's the direction of fiscal policy or monetary policy, the policy mix, taking the two into account, or structural policies. It also contains the authorities' views. We have to very candidly relay what the authorities responded when we expressed to them certain views. And at the end of this report, it has what is called a staff appraisal, which is the assessment of the staff and the board, after the report is discussed at our board, of our views on what policies have more benefits than costs. So this is available to everybody, and it is one way in which we try to share our assessment with the broader interested community about the direction of economic policies. The Article 4 reports are not only focused on, say, the short-term economic issues, such as should interest rates be raised or lowered, should the deficit be reduced, and if so, at what pace, but it also has, and critically, an assessment of medium-term trends, a discussion of what is needed in the country from a medium-term perspective, 5-year perspective, especially on matters pertaining to growth. Is growth high enough? Is it being shared broadly enough? And if not, what are the policies that need to be undertaken? So to do this in-depth analysis, the Article 4 report is accompanied by what we call selected issues papers, and these are often available on our website in a link that is separate from the Article 4 report, so you have to look for it. Usually they come together. You can think of these as in-depth research papers that dig into specific topics. So if you look at the last Article 4 report, that is from 2018, you will find 3 selected issues papers. One is on the nature of growth and what needs to be done to make growth more inclusive and more sustainable. Another chapter or a research paper looked at mobilizing tax revenues, and it did some exercises that if in certain areas Egypt's policies with respect to tax administration and the tax laws were brought up or changed in certain areas, what could be the potential revenue yield that Egypt could realize for needed spending in social areas. A third chapter looked at the framework for monetary policy, how it has evolved and what could be further areas in which it could be modernized. If you go back to the previous Article 4 reports, you'll find other such in-depth studies on such topics. So this is, in a nutshell and very briefly, how we undertake bilateral surveillance. Another very important part of the way the IMF conducts surveillance is multilateral surveillance. And this is surveillance, not economic monitoring and analysis, not of a specific country per se, but of the global economy. Now, we have some flagship products that typically convey our views on the global economy. Some of you may have heard of the World Economic Outlook or the Global Financial Stability Report. These two are published twice a year, and they contain our analysis of the major issues facing the global economy. These are important to individual countries as well. And to give you an example of what might be a relevant piece of analysis that is very current, is if you look at our most recent World Economic Outlook that has been published, you will find in it an analysis of what could be the adverse impact on global GDP, as well as GDP of particular countries and regions, from an escalation of a trade war. As you know, trade and rising protectionism is a very live issue. And you will find in one particular chapter of the World Economic Outlook various scenarios based upon either announced policies or threats by various countries, with economic modeling by our staff on what, if those policies are carried out, what would be, in quantitative terms, the impact on GDP, either of the US or, say, of China or of particular regions. Now, obviously, this is relevant for individual countries because Egypt, like many other countries, is an open economy and it trades. And so this information, which is an example of multilateral surveillance, is also available to you and is a way in which we try to share our knowledge with the countries. Now, there is a lot more that I could talk to you about the ways in which the IMF conducts surveillance, but the best way would be to really go to our website, search for the last Article 4 staff report, and take a look at it, and you would be able to see the type of surveillance, what surveillance really means. So let me end by recapping what I said at the beginning, that our current engagement in Egypt consists of 3 levels. It's the financial assistance, it's the provision of technical assistance, and surveillance. The loan program would be ending, and we are looking forward to continuing our relationship in the other 2 areas, surveillance and technical assistance, to continue to support the economic reforms of the government. Thank you.